Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I've got a plan today that is going to get us back into Mill a little bit because we didn't finish up that discussion. And then we'll make headway into this week's readings. I had you read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And we're going to use that to discuss the difference between natural rights arguments and utilitarian arguments. But first, let's get back into Mill a bit, because we just gotten to the point that he makes about conformity and the dangers of conformity. Okay? Can anybody give me a sort of nutshell definition of what conformity refers to, or conformism, you might say?
Ideas or beliefs to match those of the majority group.
Mm-hmm. Right. You're conforming. I mean, basically, it's the idea that more or less the society, the people around you, put pressure on you, or you feel pressure, right, to change your views or to match your views and your actions and all sorts of things up with what you perceive to be the majority opinion. Okay? So as, social creatures, we all feel this. And I think one of the tricks to maybe figuring out a little bit more about yourself and just why you're on the planet is probably being able to pick up on what is truly you and what is actually sort of given to you by society that you may have absorbed just because of this natural feeling of social pressure. Okay, it has some good points, which is that if we didn't have any sort of tendency to conformity, we might have so much social chaos that it might be difficult for us to be able to, communicate or to get along with each other, or to cooperate in any way. So it's not necessarily all bad, but it's something that Mill is very skeptical of as far as how much good comes from it, because he seems to think there's a strong tendency for people with good ideas to be suppressed, or for actually good ideas to not be heard, and therefore positive change not to happen. And this is a problem particularly for democracies. I mean, it's a problem generally for human beings, but particularly for democracies, because democracies encourage this by empowering the majority to a great extent. Okay. Now the natural rights people would say, well, that's why you need to have a strong concept of rights, right? We have the Bill of Rights to protect people who do decide they want to kind of get out of line of the majority and say what they think or live in a way that isn't popular or whatnot. And they're guaranteed that freedom, okay? The utilitarian says, rather, we need to convince people why it is good for society as a whole to allow for a diversity of opinions and to allow for what Mill calls eccentricity, okay? Because there's a real benefit to society that comes with this toleration, with this multiplicity of ways of life and ideas, okay? So this benefit really amounts to coming closer to the truth. The ideal is that through hearing other people's opinions and through allowing argument, people will come closer to the truth about very important issues, such as religion, morality, the way we should govern ourselves, what justice really is, and all of that, as well as good and bad lifestyles. What is a better way to live? Okay, and we do this through the process of argument, and also through the process of observing, frankly, what works and what doesn't work, and so forth. And how can you do that without allowing this freedom? So that's why you get on page 4 of your reading by Mill these various reasons, right, which he enumerates up at the top. He says, first, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion, for aught we know, can certainly be true. Okay? So we may simply be missing the truth if we don't hear it, you know? Okay. Now, what will the objection to this be? What's the foremost objection that you can think of to allowing people to hear all opinions, even if they may seem vile or really odd? Why would anybody want to pass a law, for instance, to suppress certain opinions?
Sometimes it's impractical to take time to listen to everybody's opinion on certain issues that are time sensitive.
Right. So, and maybe more generally coming off of that is just the concern for order, right? Which isn't the same as control. There is a concern for order that you have. As you say, I mean, that's one reason, just having enough time to deal with all of this and to sort through it all, as opposed to getting on with life, right? So there's that. Any other reasons why somebody might advocate for controlling opinion?
Kind of going out of order, like everyone's going to have a different opinion. It's going to go out different opinions. It's going to be hard to agree on something.
Hard to agree, right? So you spend a lot of time arguing. That's kind of, in a way, the same issue here, right? So you avoid argument. And certainly, that was Hobsbawm's view, was that, we need to realize, especially on really important issues like religion, people are prone to endless arguing, and then frightfully, this gets into violence in a lot of cases. And so, in his view, we needed to, in effect, suppress that type of opinion because it was so contentious. Okay. Anything else?
It could be confusing having so many different viewpoints on one thing. Like, it could confuse people into picking the wrong one.
Okay, yeah. Confusion, right? I mean, Mill is pretty idealistic in a way here in thinking that if people hear all kinds of opinions and sort through them, they will use reason, and over time, they will tend to choose the better of the arguments, okay? And that it sort of reflects the Enlightenment point of view about human reason, right? But one could argue, and people did argue, that no, actually, when people are exposed to a lot of opinions, especially without any sort of authority to kind of help them sort through them, trying to do it on their own, they're just as likely to arrive at a wrong opinion or a harmful opinion as they are to land on a good one. Okay? So people can and have made the argument for suppressing certain opinions on the basis of the idea that there are some folks, let's say, either that this may be the church, or it might be the nobility, or it might be elite political leaders or intellectual leaders, right? But there are people who can sort through these ideas better than the average person, and so really they ought to have some authority and guidance, and that is, can become a justification for suppressing opinion. And of course, there's just the plain old, I want power, so I don't want anybody to disagree with me, and that definitely is a real world reason for that too. So, this is what the fascists and the communists did, and a lot of people in power will simply say, I don't want to publish anything that might be used to criticize me. So there's that. Okay. So anyway, yes, this is why Mill has to make an argument. Now, these days in our country, this all seems so kind of given that it's hard to maybe understand why he spends so much time on it. Okay? But anyway, he continues. He says, secondly, though the silenced opinion may be an error, let's say, if the opinion actually is an error, it may, and very commonly does, contain a portion of the truth. So still, some part of the argument may be valid. And if you're not exposed to it, then you miss that opportunity. Or he says, thirdly, even if the received opinion be not only true, but the whole truth, unless it is suffered to be and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will by most of those who receive it be held in a manner of prejudice. Okay, let's stop and ask what that really means. What's he saying there? If an opinion is just entirely true if it doesn't have opponents, if there aren't other arguments to contrast it with? What's the result of that in people's minds?
Government control, and there's no other thing to dispatch. All kinds of training.
It becomes more or less a matter of faith, or of something being sort of given to you rather than your own. Did anybody want to add anything? Yeah, and he's saying that, first of all, I think he's pretty skeptical that there is such thing as, an easy route to the absolute truth. But yes, by preventing people from questioning, he's saying that they can't really hold that opinion with conviction, okay? Because they don't know, and they know they don't know, what could oppose it, right? And only if you have had your views challenged by other views do you really know the basis for those views, right? And the strength of those views. Okay? And if your point of view cannot hold up against criticism, then maybe it's not that good. Okay? So he's saying without that opposition, you're going to hold that view as a matter of prejudice, right? It's just given to you because that's what we're supposed to believe. And that's not very strong. Okay? So he's one of these people that believes if it can't stand up to criticism, it's no good. Okay? All right? So all of this, I think these are certainly justifications we've heard before for freedom of speech, freedom of opinion. Okay? So government, of course, can suppress good ideas and often did in the past, right? Government and or religion would suppress good ideas, and he knows this. And he poses instead, just to kind of sum up, that if people are given freedom, the good will prevail. Okay, over time, the good opinion will prevail because people are rational creatures. They can observe what works and what doesn't work. They can argue and make sense of it. Okay, and I think that's probably really the primary weakness is this assumption here. Okay, it's an enlightenment assumption that may not be true, and I don't know how you get around that. And I'm not saying that that's a good argument for not having free speech, okay? But what you will notice and observe in our society, for instance, is that there's a huge multiplicity of beliefs and lifestyles and not very much agreement. In fact, less and less agreement as time goes by. So it's not working the way Mill thought it would. You see what I'm saying? Okay. We're not getting more agreement. Now that's okay in a way because we can live peacefully. We found some formula for living peacefully with each other. But it isn't necessarily getting people closer to some truth, whatever that may be. Okay. So any other answers to this? I mean, I've kind of given you my one caveat. Does anybody else have any questions or any concerns about this argument that he makes? Or like it in particular? It's a utilitarian argument, so it's about, what will benefit us.
Kind of how it's saying, like, the good will prevail. Well, the winners of whichever argument are usually the ones that end up writing history, so they're probably going to spin it in a good light. So kind of in a way, they're right, but also not really.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it speaks to the political nature of human beings. And the political nature of human beings runs up against the Enlightenment view of human beings. In other words, the Enlightenment view is almost like people are scientific in their approach to life. We will reason about our long-term self-interest, about the good of society, and we will, make rational decisions. Whereas the political reality of human nature, if you want to look at it that way, is often not rational and has to do with power. And so, as you pointed out, the people who have power will distort the truth or cover it up or, in some way attempt to suppress it. Yeah.
Is it kind of like the lesser of two evils, like in that argument, because it's saying that there should be a place for like diverse ideas, but there are problems with that. But if there are no, like, if you can't discuss it, then it's also bad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just kind of like lesser of two evils that you should be able to discuss it.
You certainly could extrapolate that, yeah, that it's the lesser of two evils. I do think he has a sort of faith that in the end this is the best route too, though, but yeah, definitely the greater evil in Mill's mind is oppressive government. This is why we classify him as a liberal, right? Because the greatest, there's two enemies to the discovering the truth. One is government, which in democracy tends to represent the majority, right? And also there's just democratic culture, right? The people themselves within a democratic society in particular tend to govern themselves, govern each other through their sort of sheep-like behavior in following popular opinion. Okay, so those two dangers are kind of equal, I think, for Mill, and both of them are bad. So another way of looking at this is, Mill is asking, how can we have the good of democracy and try to avoid the evil of democracy, okay? Which tends to be that, in effect, we don't have the freedom we think we have because of this conformity, right? Tocqueville is even better at dealing with this because, he clearly shows us how we have freedom on paper in the Constitution and so on and so forth, but in practice, many people don't have it simply because they might have the freedom to look at alternative points of view, but they don't want to. He says Americans keep their heads down, they want to do their private business, they want to make money, they want to have their family, and they want to kind of fit in, and they don't really want to ask those questions. So Tocqueville also says people of genius tend to not rise up or be noticed in a society such as this because the average person doesn't want to hear those points of view. Not because they're suppressed from government, but because society itself is suppressing them. Okay? Which leads me to the next part of his argument where he actually uses the term genius. He says, again, this is still on the 4th page, persons of genius, it is true, are always likely to be a small minority. But in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe free in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius are ex vi termini, which means from the force of the term. In other words, by their very nature, more individual than other people. Persons of genius are more individual than any other people, less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves without hurtful compression into any of the small number of molds which society provides in order to save its members from the trouble of forming their own character. So, and I put this quote up here too, because I'd like to ask the question of how you felt when you read this and other things that he says. This quote is from further down on the page. Originality is the one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. And on page 5, there's a whole long paragraph that basically deals with the same issue. And it reminded me, this discussion, of Tocqueville also, who says many of the same things, right? That in particular people who are original have a hard time in democracy. But also Friedrich Nietzsche, who was writing around the same time period, okay? Who is unmistakably an elitist, if you want to call him that, somebody who was anti-democratic as well. Thought the democratic system was bad because it suppressed the natural superiority of some people. Okay, so Mill is not like that. He wants to preserve democracy. Democracy is good. Okay, and it can provide the freedom. It provides more happiness for everybody, he thinks, and it can provide the freedom necessary for these geniuses. But it does, socially and politically have a tendency to suppress them. So, so the question becomes, first of all, is he an elitist? And secondly, if he is some sort of elitist, is that bad? Because we tend to think elitism doesn't go with democracy, right? Just to give you a little bit more of what fits with this theme of elitism, on page 5, he says, in sober truth, whatever homage may be professed or even paid to real or supposed mental superiority, the general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power among mankind. At present, individuals are lost in the crowd. In politics, it is almost a triviality to say that public opinion now rules the world. And of course, this was the 19th century. Okay? And what is still a greater novelty, the mass do not now take their opinions from dignitaries in church or state. That is, they don't take them from learned authorities, okay, or from books. Their thinking is done for them by men much like themselves, addressing them or speaking in their name, or on the spur of the moment through the newspapers. Okay. So imagine what Mill would have to say about the television news and, programming that we have now. Further, he says the initiation of all wise or noble things comes and must come from individuals, generally at first from some one individual. The honor and glory of the average man is that he is capable of following that initiative, that he can respond internally to wise and noble things and be led to them with his eyes open. I am not countenancing the sort of hero worship which applauds the strong man of genius for forcibly seizing on the government of the world and making it do his bidding in spite of himself. Okay, so he's not talking about, not going with Nietzsche, because this is where Nietzsche goes further and says, and therefore, the strong man of genius ought to have that power. At least that's one interpretation of what Nietzsche says. Certainly other people of the time, who were harking back, as we'll see, to the feudal past, okay, wanted to either return to that past or have a new notion of what a true aristocracy was like, and to give that aristocracy the leadership. And Mill is saying here that the beauty or the glory of the average man, or another word would be the virtue of the average person, right, is that they're capable of recognizing and following that one person or those few people who have wisdom. Okay? And this seems to be, this is the right order of things for Mill. Okay? Now, one wonders, how does this fit with democracy? That's the real problem, and that's why I asked this question here. How can society benefit from originality if it consists of unoriginal minds, right? And how is it that people are supposed to recognize this instead of suppressing it? Right? But first, let me ask you, what you think of his general notion of genius and the place of genius. Is it problematic? Do you think it's wrong? Undemocratic? Did it surprise you that somebody who is pro-democracy would also hold this view? Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty natural. We all have, whether it's thinkers or politicians, to be identified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes for good reason. We can't all be Mill, and we're not all going to be Mill, right? A treatise like this,
Right.
200 years from now. So we because of the complexity of our world, we do identify in any given sphere, the leading minds.
And are we all capable of finding the right leading minds?
That's a messier question.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're all incapable.
It's not a bad thing. So, one thing Mill was really big on that's left out of your reading here, which might help us to kind of square this a little bit, is education. And so, if he were to try to answer this or to address this concern, I think he would say, everybody, every member of society, men and women alike, because he was very big on women's equality, need to be well educated. And part of the problem is if they're undereducated, or their education doesn't, create the context in which they can think for themselves, then there's more likely to be this sort of sheep-like conformity where people will latch on to bad leaders or bad ideas. Yeah.
What exactly did he mean by originality? Like, what constituted being different, and what constituted being just the same as everybody else? So, like, how there are some people who, they may go to church, they may have the same technical religion as everybody else that's in that same church, but they may practice differently. Is that his kind of originality, or is he saying something that's completely off the wall, completely different is original?
No, I don't think he's necessarily saying that the person who's original has to be completely different or off the wall. And the example that you gave would be an outcropping or a result of an original mind. In other words, I think my sense is that what he's talking about is simply a person who can think for themselves, in the sense of they don't go into that church, to use your example, just sort of thinking, well, this is the way it's got to be, and this is how I was raised, and really not thinking about it much at all, but rather they go into the church having thought through, for instance, if the church has a creed, what does it mean? Do I actually believe it, or what would it take for me to believe that? And if I don't believe it, then maybe I shouldn't be in this church, or maybe I shouldn't say this part, or I make some adjustment to what I think, and not simply just sort of go along. And so originality can lead to orthodoxy, as a matter of fact, in religion, but it means that you have to actually engage and critically assess whatever it is that you're trying to believe. Yeah.
I just feel like he's really overestimating the lack of apathy. Like, I feel like people he doesn't really understand, or he doesn't want to believe that people are just generally apathetic and they don't care about being original. Like, they're fine with being unoriginal, and they're fine with, just going along with what people tell them. Like, I think that he's making an assumption that people just generally want to care, but I guess maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the human race.
Yeah, maybe than Mill is. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, Mill strikes me as almost schizophrenic or something. He's got both the pessimism and the optimism going pretty strong at the same time. So he, on the one hand, he knows how huge that force of conformity is, and apathy is just all a part of that. Just saying, I don't care, I don't want to think about it. It's just easier to go along this way. And at the same time, he makes these statements about how people are capable of thinking for themselves, and the whole system, it seems, hinges on people being able to sort out, at least amongst the various opinion leaders. Like, a well-educated citizen ought to be able to listen to various opinion leaders and, thinking about it, come up with what they actually want to follow or believe in. And yeah, I mean, I guess what might surprise him is that, or maybe not, is that in a way that has gotten not better over time. I don't know if you can argue that it's gotten worse, because I don't know exactly how people thought, back in the 19th century. Probably a lot of people didn't even know how to read, so, but it certainly hasn't gotten a whole lot better, as you point out. An awful lot of people I mean, if you just measure apathy by engagement in the political process alone, you know that there are many people that just it washes right over them. And that's not good. I mean, one of the things that a higher education is supposed to do, at least for the few people who can get it, is to kind of yank them out of that level of apathy. And once you are yanked out of it, there's really no going back. I mean, that's one of the things that even Plato articulated pretty well in the Republic. There's no going back, there's only going forward, because you do realize there's a lot more to life. Okay. It's really, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound elitist, but it is sad to think of so many people going through life like this is your one life. Maybe, unless, there are multiple lives, but okay, this is the only life that you know about, right? And it's not that long. And you've got, 80, 90, maybe you guys 100 years on the planet. And to just sort of go through it in a fog, sleepwalking, is a serious misuse of it, So, and I think that Mill, is writing in this mode of saying, like Kant said a long time, not that long before, but a couple of generations before, wake up. This is, a human being should not sleepwalk through their lives. Dare to know, he said. So there's that, enlightenment, wish, hope that a democratic society can be fuller of people who actually are paying attention, and also that the quest itself is a value. And I've emphasized, the quest is, or the goal is truth, but also the process itself is a value. Part of what makes the human life more valuable, is to be in that process of exploration. He even uses the term eccentricity down at the bottom of the page, which I guess he would probably qualify as eccentric. I don't know, eccentric in the sense of how he was educated and how he kind of came to be. I didn't mention too much about that, but his father was John Stuart Mill. He was buddies with Jeremy Bentham. They were both big name utilitarians, and they decided to raise John Stuart Mill to be the ultimate philosopher. And so he wrote in an autobiographical vein about how he was raised, and in looking back, it was kind of an oppressive childhood. In other words, he didn't have much access to his mother. He was constantly being pushed to learn, and learn very rapidly. I guess he learned Latin. By the time he was like 5 or 6 years old, he had Latin, and it was just kind of crazy. It was a lot of pressure. He had a very high IQ. I think it was maybe 140 or 150, something like, I don't know. Anyway, he had a very high IQ, but still, he didn't have a childhood. And he was sort of treated, in hindsight, he thought, kind of like a trained poodle or something by, the way that he was raised. So he had a breakdown in his early years. And in the wake of that mental breakdown, sought out poetry, fiction, music. In other words, he was trying to get in touch with his soul, with the more human side of himself. And he ended up getting married to, I think her name was Harriet Mill, who he collaborated with, his wife, who also contributed to this process. So he's still a utilitarian, but modified in the sense that you see it coming out here in the discussion of the value of elites and informed opinion. Like you said the other day, for him, there are better and worse choices, okay, to be made that will lead you closer or farther away from happiness. So he says down at the bottom of the page, precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach. That's a nice way to put it, but in other words, the tyranny of opinion makes it socially undesirable to be eccentric or different. It is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. Let it loose, right? Eccentricity has always abounded. when and where strength of character has abounded, and the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. And I suppose that's right, because if you're original as you're thinking for yourself, then the next step is to decide you're going to live your life differently. And when you start to do that, people notice, and you have problems. So I think we'll leave that question open as far as whether it's completely compatible with democracy, or maybe it's not compatible with any real life political system to be original and eccentric. But Mill's message is fight against that conformity. There's political dangers to conformity, which Tocqueville and Mill both pointed out. Tocqueville simply thought that democracy could actually turn into tyranny, that in fact is what happened in Nazi Germany, for instance. People voted for Hitler, right? And so it's not a given that your political system of democracy will always be there, right? And so if people are more or less lemmings, waiting for somebody to lead them and tell them what to think, that strong man, right, can lead them down the wrong path. And for Mill, popular opinion or pressure to conform can be pushed through the legal system, and this is something he wants to avoid. Bill of Rights would not satisfy Mill. Okay? Our solution would not satisfy Mill. Okay? Why? Because as a utilitarian, he looks at something like the Bill of Rights as nothing more than a statement of society's ideals. Okay? So it's as good as whether people believe it and live it. Okay? There's nothing magical about rights. Rights are just social agreements. Okay? So the more important thing is for us to understand why. That's why he spends so much time on it. Why freedom is important. Why tolerance is important. That is the true bedrock, okay, for allowing for diversity of opinions, not a piece of paper, okay, which is the way he looks at it. Okay. All right, so a couple of examples, and you probably can come up with other examples. Okay, this one just occurred to me because I raised a kid, and so I had to deal with this whole phenomenon, which at the beginning of, my son's now 18, so, about when he was a little kid was when the ADHD phenomenon was in full bloom. And a lot of people didn't understand really where to draw the line. As it became known that this was a disorder, it got overdiagnosed. At least there was a concern that was getting overdiagnosed. That is, there were too many kids being labeled with this disorder and getting medicated that didn't necessarily need it. Okay? The reason why I bring this up is because as a parent, I did experience just not just about this issue, but just in general, this pressure to have a kid that was in complete conformity with the with all the expectations of the school. So when and if you become a parent, you'll probably get this loud and clear too. You feel this, then there's this constant commentary about how your particular child measures up to the norm. And the norm is considered the standard. Okay? So if your child is outside the norm, either on one end or the other, they are labeled exceptional. Okay? And there's a tendency to find some sort of diagnosis, to try to figure out some sort of diagnosis. And so, half the kids in my kids' class had some sort of, they were on drugs. So, to be blunt. And I don't know exactly how it is now, but I do know that I saw many parents considering taking their kid to the doctor to see if they could be diagnosed with ADHD so that they could hopefully fit in and meet the expectations. okay? Now, I do think ADHD is a real thing, okay? But think about that, though, that, a parent might feel such pressure that they look upon their own child as a problem to be solved so that they can be whatever the norm is, as far as social interaction, as far as academic performance, behavior, which is a big deal in grade school. Can you sit still? ADHD diagnoses tend to be much more on the male end of the spectrum than the female. And so the result of that is that there are more males in that grade school classroom on drugs than females. So you might ask yourself, why does it have to be this way? The American education system has always been about fitting in and conforming. Okay? Why do people have to sit still in desks in 3rd grade for hours at a time?
British Empire.
What's that?
British Empire.
The British, they all started it all, didn't they now? Yeah. So, anyway, that social pressure is definitely there. I can attest to that. And being the weirdo that I am, I just ignored it, and my kid's totally fine. Like, he's more than fine. And I never got, like, some people didn't even wait to get commentary from the teacher. They just sort of thought, he's running around too much, Right. Another example, maybe a little bit more current and closer to home maybe for you, because most of you probably don't have kids, is the whole concept of marriage. Okay. It does seem as though everybody kind of comes into the world, or at least our world, thinking that the normal path is to get married, have kids, and get a house. Okay? Have a good job, of course. Preferably in that order. And now gay people as well as straight people have the same vision, right? That's the American dream. Okay. There's a lot of pressure. In fact, there's so much pressure, I would argue, you wouldn't even be able to, a lot of people can't think beyond it. Okay. Now, so the results, if you're looking at this, the institution of marriage from a Millian perspective, is it's such a norm, okay? If you choose not to get married, you're outside that norm, okay? And so what do you, so socially you may have a problem, or you just may not be able to be happy because you don't fit, okay? Those who marry, because of social expectations, and he's very big on this, if you do things for the sake of social expectations, guess what? You don't achieve happiness because you're not doing what you really want. Okay? So as you fit in, you find down the road, and this happens to people all the time, they find out down the road, investing many years of their life, that this really isn't what they wanted. Okay? This isn't an argument against marriage, but it's an argument against the sort of, the sort of overwhelming tide of expectations. Okay? Do people know what I'm talking about? Okay, yeah. So many people, they get to a certain point in their life, and if they haven't found somebody, they go and they just find anybody. Right? Oh, you'll do. Believe me, I've talked to people who basically are thinking like that, or they'll have certain criteria, which is even more astonishing that, that the person has to fulfill if they're going to be their mate because of this vision of economic or, financial stability and all of this stuff. Okay. So Mill had a lot to say about relationships between men and women and of marriage. and was very critical of marriage at his time. He wasn't anti-marriage, but he was definitely arguing that you should only go into it if this is actually good for you or what you actually want to do. And it ought to be acceptable, and he aimed this particularly at women, it ought to be acceptable to not get married as well. Well, that was a weird, weird idea, you know, then. It's not quite as weird now, but it's still pretty weird. Okay. Anybody want to comment on that, or you have any other examples of how conformism works in our society and does harm?
I just think that's funny because like so many people like they're rage with all like the online dating and stuff like that. And like people, as soon as you get to, you know, after college or like even just a few years out of college, it's like, I'm 30, I need to get on a dating website because I haven't found that person yet.
Right.
Or, I don't know, it's just like such that rush to find someone and to settle down. I don't know, it's just really interesting. There's even those people, like even TV shows when people are like, well, let's make this deal, and if we aren't dating, or if we aren't like married by 40, then we'll get married or something like that. And I mean,
the two of them would get nobody else around. Well, we'll just
but I just think that that's really funny, just because I mean that really is something that's just kind of societal. It's just accepted. So you know you have to do it one way or another, and like that's got to be the end. So you're just like searching for a means to an end. That why is that your end?
That's So I mean. Granted, I'm at a different point in my life, so I spend a lot of my life thinking the same way, but it almost looks to me, I mean, when I look at it more objectively, almost like a bunch of people walking like automatons towards a cliff. I mean, I'm sorry, but you know, don't walk off the cliff, okay? I mean, that's, if nothing else, I mean, this is what good education really is about, is helping people think about life independently so that they don't walk off cliffs. You know, the only reason for making a lifetime commitment with somebody is if you really love the hell out of them, right? Not because of, you know, the house and the car and the kids and what will my parents think or what will my friends think, right? But people do it all the time, yeah.
Kind of ironically, couldn't you say a social norm is coming and going to college and is harming a lot of people because they come and don't necessarily, they come here and don't come because they want to be better people, want to learn, they just come because it's kind of like what you do after high school.
Yeah.
And the harm is the massive amount of student loan debt that is now being created if you don't have that plan.
That's excellent. What a great point. Yeah, there is this huge expectation that you must go to college, and there's prejudice against the technical careers. You know, the other ways of becoming a professional are not esteemed as highly.
Schools and stuff.
Yeah. Not esteemed as highly as the college-educated person. So, right, and that is a very real harm. If you have not really, if you go to college but you just sort of don't get an education, so you end up not a whole lot better off than you were before, but you've got this huge amount of debt. Yeah.
So how have you viewed changing conformity? So over the years, you know, the social norms change. So with marriage, how, you know, if you were unhappy back then, you didn't get a divorce, you just kind of stuck together. Whereas today, if you're not happy, you can easily get a divorce.
Right.
With the conformity bit, would he still say that, you know, even though you're unhappy in a marriage today, since it is the norm to just go ahead and get a divorce, should you still not conform to that or do that?
Well, I mean, again, I mean, it all depends on where that decision comes from, right? Mill wants people to think for themselves and not do what society expects. So if thinking it through, the value of marriage is the most important thing, or the fact that you made a commitment is actually meaningful to you, then it would be a legitimate decision to stay in a bad marriage. I mean, the point is, don't do something simply because it's the path of least resistance and other people expect you to. Okay? And that's harder than you think. And I think it's right. You're right to point out there's a social expectation of divorce too. If you start to have problems in your marriage, people will start to tell you, well, you don't deserve this. Just move on, and that does its own harm, right? So people too often don't think for themselves. I think that's the overall message. So it doesn't lead to any one outcome. It leads to supposedly, he thinks, you being happier with the decisions you make and with the way that you live because they're yours. Okay. This is not too far from the birth of existentialism also, where you get even more of this message of, live authentically, make your own decisions, okay, as really the only way that you can live a good life. All right, well, we're out of time, but when we come back, if there's anything left over from this, we can deal with it, and then we'll get into Martin Luther King.